one thing that I learned was what I had perceived about Lincoln's. We kind of say, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln freed the slaves."
Mm-hmm.
That's what most people know. Lincoln freed the slaves, but they don't know the complications of that. So, what I've been learning about Lincoln is that it changed over time. He grew over time. So,
Yeah,
what do you think
absolutely.
toward that um, the beginning of the war till he
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln was never an abolitionist, but he hated slavery. And there's a difference. There was very few real abolitionists. Best estimates about 5% by the time of the Civil War. It's ironic because the war helps convert a lot of people to believe in abolitionism. Lincoln never wanted slavery. He wanted to get rid of it, but he couldn't see a way to do it. You might remember that the original 13th Amendment is the ones that abolishes slavery. There was an original 13th Amendment that Lincoln reluctantly but was willing to sign, said that he would never, ever, and the federal government would never, ever end slavery where it already existed. That is, South Carolina could have slavery today if that 13th Amendment had passed. But that's not what the Confederacy was about. They wanted to expand slavery, sort of a slave empire, and Lincoln drew the line at the expansion of slavery. Lincoln would have liked to have ended slavery, but thought that the Constitution kept him from doing it. It's only through war powers that he was able to do it. Today we criticize politicians for being flip floppers. Well, thank goodness Lincoln was a flip flopper. As he learned more, Lincoln had this incredible, flexible mind. He could be the poster boy for continuing education. With less than a year's formal education, he was always learning, reading. Checked out 400 and something books from the Library of Congress while he was president, if you can imagine, during this time, teaching himself military tactics, learning. Just to keep his mind sharp, he learned Euclid geometry. This is the kind of man he was. And the more he learned, particularly on race relations, the more that he changed. Here in South Carolina, in this very area, Robert Smalls, who in fact is the hero of the planter, who after you have the invasion of the Beaufort area, the Sea Islands in November 1861, in 1862, Robert Smalls steals the planter, the ship that he's working on, sails it out under the nose of the Confederates and turns it over, in fact, to the Union Army, and he later actually is working on that. He saves the planter again. He becomes a hero all over the Union. Here's what an African American is capable of. He's one of the reasons that people are arguing less arm African Americans, let's let African Americans, former slaves, fight in this war. And supposedly he meets with Lincoln for over an hour, at which point Lincoln says to him, "Why would you risk your life? Your children, your wives' lives, the lives of your men." And Small supposedly gives him a one-word answer: freedom. 1 year later, that is the word that Lincoln echoes in the Gettysburg Address and becomes this new birth of freedom that we now celebrate in American history throughout. So I think there's a direct relationship to what goes on in South Carolina. That's just one example of Smalls, but you have many other examples right here in Port Royal and the rehearsal for Reconstruction.
that's
Is that good?
wonderful. Yes, that was wonderful.
Now I can tell you more about Lincoln. There's a lot more
Well, that's
detail, but
well. The next question I was going to ask is, how much do you think that Lincoln watched or was informed by Chase and Stanton, who were who claimed to be abolitionists, who were right out there,
Mhm.
and who also were always speaking directly to Saxton and Higginson. Um, Now, I know that he knew about um, Hunter and that whole thing, but how much do you think he watched and was informed by Port Royal experiment to go forward with the initial Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, I think he was informed, but he was dealing with the war, and he was, he's been criticized at being slow, that is, thinking things through, but made up his mind. But once he made up his mind, he moved forward very quickly. A good example is you can look at his letters. He writes to Chase, I'm going to sort of put this in your ballpark. I want you to do right. He appoints William Brisbane, who had been a planter here in the Low Country himself, who moved away, who ends up freeing his enslaved people, tries to buy them all back so that he is sold, so that he can then free them, all but one, who, of course, he meets when they are reading the Emancipation Proclamation, who had freed himself, as many had. And it's interesting because it is Brisbane who gets to be a judge appointed by Lincoln on the recommendation of Chase and others, that then makes the rulings that African Americans have the right to the land, so that why African Americans were able to have this land in the Low Country and the Sea Islands over the years. So there's a lot of direct involvement. Lincoln, it's interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation because you'll remember that Horace Greeley wrote a letter, and it was called the Prayer of 20 Million. And that's significant because that is the exact population of the free states. And it was a prayer that Lincoln would abolish slavery and end slavery. And Lincoln responds to Greeley not in his liberal paper, but in a conservative paper. And this is often quoted, this famous quote that Lincoln said, "If I could win this war by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could win it by freeing none, I would. If I could win this war by freeing some and not others, I would." And that's actually what he did. But people miss the last line where he says, "Now this is how I see my official duty, how I'm bound by the Constitution. I want to go on record saying my personal belief, I'm against slavery everywhere and would end it wherever I possibly could." Now here's what's ironic about this. When Lincoln writes this letter, when Greeley writes his letter, Lincoln's already written the Emancipation Proclamation. He's already told both Secretary of War Gideon, he's already told Secretary of Navy Gideon Welles, who writes about it, Secretary of State Seward, that he's going to do it. He's already announced it to his cabinet later in that. So why didn't Lincoln say, "Well, thank you, Horace, for giving me the opportunity. Guess what I have in my desk right here? An Emancipation Proclamation." It's because Lincoln was a gifted politician. He knew he was ahead of the country. He had to bring the rest of the country to where he was and to where the abolitionists were to make emancipation work. And he did that his whole life. And I believe at the end of his life, that's exactly where he was going in terms of black citizenship. In the Gettysburg Address, then his second inaugural, and then his famous last speech, where John Wilkes Booth heard him talk and talked about voting rights for those soldiers, anybody who had fought for the Union, for taking care of the widows of those who fought, which meant African Americans, women, widows, as citizens. And Booth turns to his companion and says, that'll be the last speech he'll ever make. He's talking about, he uses the N-word, citizenship. And of course, then Booth kills him. So Lincoln was not killed for the Emancipation Proclamation, but for advocating African American citizenship and black voting rights.
That's great.
I got us away from South Carolina. I need to figure a way.
No, it's
You're okay with that?
Yeah. Here's one thing that we want to talk about as this goes into the 30